Greetings to everyone who's watching and listening globally on this very important summit on sustainable development. I'll be speaking on the Women's Safety, Peace and Development Nexus. When we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, we always forget the very important element in terms of the role of women in and equity and women's safety in the equation. Out of the 17 SDGs, if you look the Sustainable Development Goal on equality, women's gender equality, which is the SDG 5, then we go to the SDG 16, which talks about peace and security. Those two needs to be looked into jointly, and hence I thought this topic is very important, women's safety, peace and development nexus. There cannot be any development without safety and security, nor development without peace, because this affects how any country or any continent can function in a united fashion. I think I will go into the details of the presentation to make the point that I'm trying to raise around women's role in terms of the development holistically, and hence women, peace and safety and development nexus. Globally, we have experienced the pandemic, which is very similar to how the countries and the world is affected by peace. And the same when you talk about safety and security. Women are the most affected. I want to talk about the protocols, the global protocols and policy directives that will guide our engagement today, Agenda 2063 and the African Continent Free Trade Area Agreement and the UN SDGs 2030. And these are the protocols, whether we're looking into the continents or we're looking globally, that we need to take into consideration when we analyze and look through how these four relate, that is women, peace, safety, and development. The 7 aspirations of the Agenda 2063 talks about prosperous Africa based on inclusive development. But what is most important here, I want to single out the 2 aspirations. The 4th aspiration, which talks about peaceful and secure Africa. And Africa whose development is people-driven, relying on the potential of African people, especially its women and youth, and caring for the children. When there is war, we have experienced the wars that are happening in East Africa, that the most affected people are women and children. Women have to pick up the pieces when there are people that are affected, the victims of war, whether it's disability that is a result of the wars, or children, for that matter, that get involved and get used in these war zones. And the other element is how they become vulnerable themselves in the whole process when there is instability and war in any country. The Sustainable Development Goals talks about no poverty, SDG 1, no poverty, 0 hunger, SDG 2, SDG 3, good health and well-being, and my favorite, gender equality, SDG 5. And SDG 6 talks about peace, justice, and strong institutions. And therefore, if there is no peace, there is lawlessness, women are disrespected and they become very vulnerable. And I use the analogy of the COVID-19, though it's not war, but it was an instability that actually affected women and made them vulnerable, especially those that were staying alone with their children. They become very vulnerable to their own partners, but sometimes to intruders. So key to development is women at the center. Very important that when you talk about development, women need to be empowered. So no peace, no safety, you cannot have development at all. How then does instability affect women in development? Gender-based violence and femicide escalates because of the vulnerability, whether they're in the camps, whether they are left alone by their husbands or their sons who have gone to war, so they become exposed. In some cases, when there are soldiers that are deployed in those areas, they become perpetrators of gender-based violence themselves. I've spoken about the disability that might emerge. We know that in cases of war, we have people that have actually lost their limbs because of such. And women are the ones who have to pick up to take care of those people. And some of them, they have to leave their jobs to take care of the victims of war. Psychosocial impact of wars and instability. Wars, they have far-fetching impact on people psychologically. To date, people that have been exposed to war zones, some of them, they've been affected mentally, and this becomes a burden on women to take care of such people. And also, some of these people were breadwinners, and when they come home now, women have to see and fend for the entire family if the breadwinner is actually lost through death or lost through loss of income, because now they've become incapable due to disability or mental disturbance because of them being involved in the war zones. There's a report which outlines the impact of war. It emphasizes the point that the conflict destroys lives. When you talk about destroying life, it's not about physical loss of life. There can be loss of life if the person is no longer the same person that he or she was before the war. Livelihoods, because the economy is affected. We know currently the war in Libya and in East Africa, recently even in Ethiopia, the instability affects the economy. It affects families much more, but women are disproportionately affected by this because of the role that they have to play. Existing inequalities and inequities get magnified, and even decades after conflict, the examples that I used earlier on of post-war, the effect that these have on women, that they have to take care of their families, they have to take care of the victims of war. Armed conflict often disproportionately has negative health effects as well. So you cannot talk about well-being and good health when there is war, because the resources, they're also affected. And women and children and girls, because of their vulnerability, they are at the high risk of injury and even death and mental illness, because the pressure that they have to endure in the whole situation, it can affect their mental state. Displacement and trafficking. Children and women make up an estimate of 80% of displaced population. This is according to UNICEF report of 1995. And girls and women are amongst the most vulnerable. And we know the refugee camp is not the best place to be in, but is the only option that in cases of war that families run to, the women, they run into such places. But even there, they get abused, so there is no total safety. And these facilities, they're also not appropriate. They don't have appropriate sanitation, water, and also education for young girls and healthcare. And they even get abused sexually and otherwise, and also discriminated because it's more like people fending for themselves. So when they are there with men, men take precedence in terms of distributing those resources. And it's more like a survival of the fittest in such camps. But we know historically, women are agents and symbols of peace. In the African culture, it was known that when there is war or people are fighting, when a woman runs and goes in between these people that are fighting, it means stop war. And I think this is where we need to be in terms of positioning women in places where they can influence the decisions that the decision in terms of whether how to resolve conflicts without resorting to war. It therefore means that women have to be at the center of decision making. We need to have more women in leadership positions so that when such decisions are taken, they can influence from the point of experience and knowing the impact of war and insecurity in our communities, in our countries, in the continent. We cannot talk about of intra-Africa trade if the countries are at war. The countries cannot relate to one another. So they also should be part of finding solutions to conflict resolutions. As symbols and agents of peace, women naturally are negotiators. And therefore, if they're given a position in terms of them being involved as ambassadors of peace, as leaders in their countries, in their communities, they are in a position to bring peace and safety in those communities. So for Africa to realize both the Agenda 2063 and SDG 2030, promotion of peace and safety is at the core of sustainable development. And we cannot talk about peace, safety, and development at the exclusion of women. When you talk about development, women everywhere you go are in the majority, 50 plus. And therefore, there is no development at the exclusion of 50% plus of your community. You need to take it into consideration that as you look at your development plans, first, we need women at the center as leaders. And this talks to the Agenda 2063, the aspiration of Agenda 2063, where the development is centered around its people, with women and youth taking their role as leaders and as equal participants in the development of the economy of our continent. Secondly, when we talk about gender and generation equality, it therefore means that gender equality, both at the, socially, in the economy, in political decision-making positions, women have to be there. Diversity is at the core of development. And therefore, this must be seen as a business imperative, not just as a compliance issue. And it is about time, when we talk about sustainable development, we understand that the role that women have to take actively. And this must be at the core of the transformation and sustainable development in our continent and globally for that matter, we are left with just 8 years towards the review of the Sustainable Development Goals, the Agenda 2030. And it is therefore paramount, it's of paramount importance that as we look at consolidating the remaining 8 years, we look at this particular goal, the Agenda 20, the SDG 16, excuse me, agenda of the SDGs, and see how women can play a prominent role to bring peace in the continent, to bring peace in the world, through the role that they would play in the other areas, whether it is in the economy, in terms of economic empowerment. So development and empowerment has to be at the core of any country's agenda if we are really serious about the aspirations of 2063 as the African continent, as well as globally, if we really want to realize the SDG 2030, the UN SDGs 2030, we need to put women at the center. We can only do that when we have empowered women. We look into the empowerment of the young girls, starting at the level of a school-going girl child, and also the young people. For when I talk about the young people, I don't talk gender, because we need to promote equality for young people, so that they have that respect for one another, so that we don't talk about gender-based violence, which hampers development in our continent and globally. So as I summarize, I would like to push forward the point that when we talk about sustainable development, we should not exclude women at any of the programs that we'll be looking at in terms of thriving the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And if we talk about the peace, justice, and security, and stable institutions, we need to make sure that women are empowered, women are in a position on decision-making positions at all levels and in all spheres, or whether it's the government, whether it's in the business, whether it's the global positioning in terms of ambassadorship. Women have to be there so that we can bring stability for sustainable growth in our continent and in the world. Thank you.